Good morning. I'd like to continue my series on the World Championship match from 2014 between Vishy and Magnus Carlsen, the reigning champion, and Vishy the challenger. The first game was drawn, the second game was a win to Carlsen, and the third game, fantastic win to Anand. Fourth and fifth games were drawn, and now we're in the sixth game. So let's see what happens. Magnus plays e4, c5, Sicilian, fighting for his own advantages instead of trying to combat white's advantages. Knight comes to f3, and the pawn comes to e6. It's perfectly acceptable. I'll just get rid of the analysis. French variation. The pawn comes to d4, an open Sicilian, and it's taken. The pawn comes to a6. This is known as the Sicilian defense can variation. Yeah, it's a different can from the can in Carol can because he has only one N in his name. The pawn comes to c4. This is known as the Marocci bind after the Hungarian chess master Géza Marocci. You get a good grip with these pawns on the d5 square. In the Sicilian, if black can ever play d5 in a useful and productive way, then he has a good position. And this says, no, that's not happening kind of immediately by taking a good grip on that square. So the knight comes to f6 to threaten the e pawn, and the knight comes to c3 to defend it. Bishop comes to b4 to pin the pawn, and the queen comes to d3 to defend the bishop and defend the pawn. Defend the knight, sorry, and the pawn. So the knight comes to c6 and it's taken immediately, and Carlsen takes the pawn. He obviously likes the idea of this structure. You might think now that he would play bishop to g5 to pin this knight, stop it taking this pawn since this defender is pinned. But he doesn't do that. He attacks the knight instead, and the knight doesn't come to e4 because even although it's pinned, he could just attack defend the knight here. And if he takes with the queen, with the knight, takes with the king, and king comes here. And yeah, it's a perfectly acceptable position for black, for white, even although he's playing against the two bishops because of the advanced pawn giving him more space. Bishop comes to f4 to defend the pawn, and he takes on c3 with check. So this creates double pawns for white, but he still has a really good grip on the d5 and indeed on the d4 square. So king comes to c7, he's not going to bother castling. Pawn comes to h4. This is partly to take up space on the queen side, and you'll see the other reason for it soon enough. Pushes a little bit further, and he takes it. And the rook comes to d3. The other reason for pushing the pawn is to allow the chance to develop the rook to h3. Pawn comes to b7, but he instead takes the rook to d3 so that he can play that rook to g3. Very smart. And the rook does indeed come to g3, where it defends this pawn from the attack by the bishop and also attacks this pawn. The rook swings over to defend it, and the bishop comes out. Knight comes to f8. Maybe he's thinking about playing g3, g6, and breaking out. The bishop falls back. g6 is played and is taken, and the knight takes. And the rook comes to h5. So both rooks are in the game in a little unusual way. Bishop comes to c6. It's a better square. It's further forward. He might at some point in time also be able to play bishop here. The bishop falls back and the king goes to b7. The rook comes to g4 and the pawn comes to a5. The bishop comes to d1. Great. Looking at transferring to this square and maybe swapping off. Bishop comes to d8 and the bishop goes back to c2 and the bishop goes back to g8. Are we going to have a repetition draw? No, we're not. The king comes to d2. I'm just going to switch on the analysis because this turns out to be a terrible blunder by Carlsen. He should have played king to e1, d1, sorry, because there's a problem with playing to d2. Bishop to d1, it says. Best problem with playing to d2 is that he has a tactical plan. He can take the pawn on d5, e5, and if the rook takes, then he takes the other pawn with check, and then he can swap off the rook, and he's gotten 2 pawns, and it would be 2 pawns up. It says minus 1.98, but yeah, it is a very good position for Vishy, and probably winning, but it wouldn't be so simple and straightforward to win as that. But Vishy played fairly quickly. He did take some time to think about it. He did play a4 fairly quickly, and he missed it. And as soon as he played a4, you could see, as soon as he played a4, he seen the idea, and he shook his head a little bit. And after this, which could have been a real turning point in the game in Vishy's favour, after this, he was a little bit unconcentrated and didn't play his best. And you've got to be at your best when you're playing against Carlsen. So the king comes to e2, and it's now safe. I'll get rid of the analysis. So pawn comes to a3. Great advancing it, but it's now advanced to a dark square where it can't be defended by the bishop. It can only be defended by the rook. So he plays to g3, f3 to really to cut out this pawn so that the rook can move where he wants it to move. Rook comes to d8 and the king comes to e1. Rook comes to d7 and the king on the bishop goes and attacks the pawn on a3. Defended by the rook, but really, does the rook want to be defending that pawn? Is that a good job for the rook? King comes to e2, the bishop comes to a4. He wants to swap off, and then his rook comes here, and then this pawn is difficult to defend. But Carlsen says, no thanks. And he plays e4 check. Bishop comes back to c6, and he takes the knight. And that way he's picking up a pawn. And this pawn is difficult to defend, and this pawn is difficult to defend. And he's definitely getting the upper hand. So he takes that pawn, and now he's threatening this pawn with both rooks and with the bishop, and he may eventually be threatening this pawn. Bishop comes to d1, and he takes the a pawn, and he's now got 6 pawns against 3. He's 3 pawns up. So the rook comes to threaten the pawn, and the king moves all the way, so if the rook takes the pawn, it will not be check. So the bishop comes also the way to c2, so that the rook threatens the knight on the bishop on a3. But Carlsen says check, and either the king has to come in the way of the bishop here, or if he comes here, rook here will lead to mate. If he goes back, then Carlsen will just play rook to e8 check and swap off the rooks. And so Anand will just, and the h6 pawn is about to fall, so Anand will just be lots more pawns behind. There's not really anything to play on for here. And so he resigns, and Carlsen, instead of potentially being 2-1 behind, is suddenly 2-1 up. And they played 6 games, half the 12-game match. The conditions for the championship match at this point in time were 12 games. Whoever gets the best result of 12 games is the world champion. And Carlsen leads 2-1 halfway through. Yeah, Don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe to my videos. Thanks. Bye.